Hello, everybody, and welcome to what's going to be the first of a two-parter on the chemistry of life. Here's a woman who, at the sunrise or sunset, is doing yoga on a beach, right? Beautiful scene. The big question is, why should she care about chemistry? Even though it seems very disparate, the reality is that everything she's doing right now is driven entirely by chemistry. Everything from the motions, the muscle movements, the stretches, the breathing, and also the fact that she's probably doing this as a way to control her so-called metabolism. All right, so whether it's this woman on a beach, whether you're a run-of-the-mill person, or especially a biologist, we care about chemistry. But there's some types of chemistry that are more applicable than others, and specifically the chemistry of water. You know, and probably have heard ever since you were a kid, something about how the human body is 70% water. That is true. We are basically a walking bag of water, of an aqueous solution with a whole bunch of things dissolved into it. So all of the reactions that make up our metabolism, all the different chemical processes that are happening, they're happening in an aqueous solution. So in some ways, you're just kind of a walking bag of reactions, right? And it makes a lot of sense. If you think about the search for life on other planets, we look for water. Why? Because we can't conceptualize life without water, right? Being present. We can't even fathom what that might even look like, right? So today we're going to talk about chemistry, and we're going to get to eventually the chemistry of biology, not quite biochemistry, but we're getting there. But before we do that, we have to kind of understand some of the basics about chemistry. So I'm sure at some point in your life you have encountered the periodic table. And the periodic table is basically a visual representation of the placement of various elements. So what is an element? Well, you know that chemicals are made up of atoms, right? So elements are basically the absolute purest form of an atom. So every element has a particular arrangement within that atom, right? So one type of atom. So if you have pure gold, that means that in that pure gold there is nothing but gold atoms in there, right? If you have pure magnesium, that means there's nothing other than magnesium in there, right? So obviously most things are in various mixes, right? But each of those types of atoms are assigned as a particular element. And if you look at the periodic table, there are specific things that every periodic table shares that have, that you probably know and are familiar with, but let's review them anyway. First, you have a symbol, right? And the symbol is usually one or two letters that indicate the name. Okay. Then you also have some numbers associated with it. You have, first of all, an atomic number, and an atomic number is basically the number of either protons or electrons that are present in that atom. As you know, an atom is made up of three parts. There are the protons, the electrons, protons being positively charged, electrons being negatively charged, and then you have these neutrons inside the middle of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about the structure a little bit later. So the technical definition of an atomic number is the number of protons for that element, all right? So number of positively charged protons, and we'll get to why that is, right? But as you probably know, that if you're neutral, which is what most elements at least try to be, a stable element, usually that means you have positively charged protons that are balanced out by negatively charged electrons. Now another number you have is the group number, and this is how we arrange the actual table. So in columns, you have the group number, which is the number of what they call the valence electrons. These are the electrons located on the outermost shell. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this is, right? But this is why you have the specific location that each of these elements occupy on the periodic table, right? So you see you've got, hydrogen's first, and then the second one all the way on the other side is helium, right? And they occupy that first row. Well, hydrogen has one valence electron. It only has one shell. It's got one electron. Helium, on the other hand, has two. And because it has two, it occupies what they call a full valence. After that, you follow accordingly. So as you move from left to right, you're basically adding electrons to the valence shell. Right? So you go from group 1, group 2, group 3, up to 8. Now, as far as biologists go, there's a lot of these fancy, crazy elements. Some of them are entirely synthetic or have been observed once in the course of some nuclear reaction somewhere. As far as biologists go, we're interested in pretty much a suite of these. So carbon-based life forms, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, chloride, iodine. These are what we call our major nonmetals that are biologically relevant. So a nonmetal is something that doesn't conduct electricity or heat. Right? They're not very good at doing that, and they're shown here in yellow or orange, whatever that color is. We also have some metals, which by definition, metals actually do conduct heat and do conduct electricity. And there's specific reasons for doing so, which we won't get to right now. But in biology, the metals that matter are a lot of the ions. So sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, iron, these are the major metals. So between these metals and nonmetals, these are basically what 99.99999% of biological reactions involve. Okay? So you'll learn a lot more of these as you move through. So how do you read it? Well, the atomic number is usually at the top. That's indicating your valence shell electrons. You've got your symbol there, your atomic symbol. And then underneath it, you have your atomic mass. Now, what's your atomic mass? Your atomic mass is basically the number of protons plus the other thing, neutrons, that occupy the middle, or the nucleus, right? So in this diagram here for helium, the nucleus is that gray center, which is what a nucleus is. It's in the middle. That's occupied by your protons and your neutrons. And then you have your electrons orbiting around outside, right? So because electrons are so tiny, they don't really contribute much to the atomic mass at all. But as you gain more protons and neutrons to balance them out, your atomic mass starts to increase, right? So it's an important property. We'll get to that a little bit later on. You'll use the atomic mass for all sorts of calculations as you move through biology. So again, this is what an atom looks like, right? Positively charged protons, neutrally charged, no charge neutrons in the middle, making up your nucleus, and then they're being orbited by electrons that have a negative charge. So it's kind of like, a model of the solar system, right? You have planets that orbit the sun. The sun in this case would be the nucleus. And then you have these planets that orbit around. And just like in space, there's usually nothing in between the electrons and the protons, right? So this is the atomic structure. Now, if you wanted to get crazy, or if you're a big fan of Ant-Man or you're into physics, you probably know that you can go into the nucleus and see even smaller things, right? Things like quarks and stuff like that. Those are what we call subatomic particles. They're outside of the realm of biology. They're mostly a physics/chemistry thing, right? But an important thing to remember is in an atom, most of the atom, in terms of the actual structure of it, is going to be empty space with only a small part occupied by the nucleus and an even smaller part occupied by the electrons. All right, so let's talk about the electrons that really matter. The most important electrons in terms of how things react with each other in a chemical reaction are the ones located on the outermost shell, right? So these are the valence electrons. These are the electrons that are going to determine how that atom is going to interact with other atoms, right? Now, a thing to remember is that biology is basically just the product of a bunch of chemical reactions. And if you were to add up all of these chemical reactions in your body, some of them use energy, some of them create energy, all of them together, the sum of that is what we call metabolism. And any living thing has a metabolism because there's reactions that have to happen for that living thing to be, right? So any idea what we call this? We call it metabolism, right? So as far as biology is concerned, simply because of the type of atoms that we're interested in, whether it's metals or nonmetals, we tend to focus primarily on those first two valence shells because anything that has more than that is the type of metal or type of nonmetal that you don't tend to see in biological systems. So the first shell, the one closest to the nucleus, has 2 electrons, and that's the maximum it could hold, right? So the only two that really have this sort of relevant first shell are hydrogen as well as helium. right? And hydrogen in particular has only a single electron orbiting a single proton, right? But as you become bigger and bigger, you get into carbon atoms or oxygen atoms, you start seeing the shell, the second shell. And the second shell can hold a maximum of 8, what we call an octet, right? So the thing is that these electrons are negatively charged. And you might have heard at some point in your life something about opposites attract. Well, things that are the same tend to repel each other, right? So sort of the same thing with human relationships, right? If you're too similar, you tend to not be friends, right? You need to have something different, right? Especially if you've got a bad attitude. So in the case of these atoms here, what the electrons will try to do is space each other out as far as possible, right? And as a result, they'll tend to occupy opposite spaces from each other. So look at the carbon atom here. The carbon atom has has an atomic number of 6, meaning that it has 6 electrons total, 2 of them in the innermost shell, which maxes out at 2 electrons, leaving the remaining 4 in the outermost valence shell. So in that outermost valence shell, they're going to space each other out as far as possible. Now here's the thing, though. Electrons, to essentially have a very stable atom, they want to have that whole valence shell full, meaning that they're not going to be able to react anymore. So what ends up happening is this weird thing where you get these octet pairs forming. So you'll actually have electron pairs. Now if you have an unpaired electron, that unpaired electron is available for a chemical reaction, right? So in this case, in the carbon atom, that carbon atom can basically react 4 different times because it has 4 outermost electron shells on its valence shell. The oxygen atom, on the other hand, has 6 electrons in its valence shell, but 2 of those or 4 of those are going to pair up, leaving only 2 that are going to be free, just like in the way this diagram shows it. So that oxygen is able to interact with 2 other atoms using those unpaired electrons. All right, so how do you form a complete octet? Well, if you don't have the electrons yourself, then what you do is you find another atom that has them. So here's a carbon atom. And the carbon atom has 4 electrons that are unpaired, as we mentioned before. And here's 4 hydrogens, each with their own unpaired electron. Well, what can they do? Well, they can basically share. And if they share, they produce what's called a covalent bond. So a covalent bond is formed whenever electrons are shared between 2 atoms. All right? So here, for example, carbon plus 4 hydrogens will produce a methane, CH4. Right? Now, if you're a molecule that can potentially double up on these pairings, right? So for example, if you are a carbon molecule, or carbon atom, sorry, you have 4 unpaired electrons, and then 2 oxygens come by, well, each of those 2 oxygens is going to have 2 unpaired electrons each. So then you can potentially bind the carbon can bind all of its unpaired electrons by forming double bonds. So that's what you get here. Right? So carbon plus 2 oxygens produces CO2, carbon dioxide. We'll talk a lot about carbon dioxide in this class. So carbon dioxide is forming these double bonds, double covalent bonds, right? And in some cases, you could even form more than that. So nitrogen, for example, nitrogen has 3 unpaired electrons, and it basically will bind 3 times and form a triple covalent bond with another nitrogen atom, producing N2. So nitrogen gas is the most common atom in the atmosphere, right? And the reason it's the most common in the atmosphere is because it's very stable, right? It's hard to break a nitrogen bond with another nitrogen. Now here's the other thing. As soon as you form a covalent bond, you've graduated from being an atom to a compound. And you can start calling yourself something fancy like a molecule, all right? So atoms by themselves, as soon as they form a covalent bond, they become a compound, right? And they start forming a larger molecule. But here's the question. Are covalent bonds equal? So first question is, what does equal mean, right? So what I mean by equal is that sharing essentially a 50-50 process. So here's hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas forms when two hydrogen atoms run into each other and they start sharing their electron. Well, they're both hydrogens, so they're going to exert an equal attractive force on the electrons. So the best way to think of it is they're going to split the relationship 50-50, right? They're both the same, they're equal partners, so to speak. But what happens if that partnership is unequal? Well, to understand that, you have to understand something called electronegativity. So electronegativity is sort of a general term used to describe the, I guess to kind of continue with the space example, think of it as like the gravity or the gravitational force on an electron. If you are very electronegative, it means you have a very strong attraction to electrons, i.e. your atom is going to pull on that electron. If you have very low electronegativity, that means that your atom is going to exert a very weak force on that electron, a very weak attraction, right? So what are some electronegative things? Well, you can kind of see this periodic table, which in this case is not divided between metals and nonmetals, but is divided on the basis of electronegativity. Well, you have very electronegative compounds, especially on the right side. So things like oxygen, for example, would exert a very strong pull on an electron, whereas something like hydrogen would have a much lower pull, right? If you get into some of these things like sodium, a very weak electronegativity, right? It's a very weak force, right? So sodium especially, keep that one in mind, right? So the bottom line is this property of electronegativity is a very good indicator of how reactive an atom is. How likely is it to give up its electron or share its electron? And when it does, how is it going to share it, right? So it's a very good indicator of how atoms are going to react in a reaction, right? If you're going to react, you're going to react in a reaction, right? So it's a very useful property to consider and very, very relevant for biology. So how is electronegativity? How are the valence electrons and the number of them? And maybe even the size of the atom related? Well, it's complicated, but it's also very much intuitive. So let's take the example that we're going to be talking about a lot in this class, which is water. So water is made up of an oxygen molecule and two hydrogen atoms, an oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, right? And when they bind, well, we already saw that oxygen has one of the highest electronegativities, meaning that it has a very strong pull on electrons. So when it binds with a hydrogen atom, it's got a much bigger pull on the electrons than the hydrogen atom does, right? So think of it as almost like the larger the atom, the nucleus, the more of a pull it is. And if there's a big difference between the two, you'll get a more unequal relationship. So instead of splitting the electrons, say 50-50, they're now splitting it 70-30 with the oxygen getting ahead. So in a water molecule, what this means is that those electrons are going to be closer to the nucleus of the oxygen atom than they are to the hydrogen, right? So in this case, what's going to happen is it's going to change the properties of water. And water is such a magnificent molecule, and it's largely because of this, right? So water is what we call a very polar compound, and it forms polar covalent bonds because of this unequal sharing. So what that means is that one side of the molecule is going to be different than the other side of the molecule. And it's going to allow water to produce something called a hydrogen bond, which we'll get into a little bit later. I love hydrogen bonds. They're very, very useful. So you notice here, the water molecule binds these electrons, and now you have a positive charge on the side where the hydrogens are, and a negative charge on the side where the oxygen is exposed. Well, it's because the oxygen's pulled the electrons closest to it, and it has a couple of extra electrons now, so it's going to take on a net negative charge, because electrons are negative. Whereas the hydrogen atom has now lost its control, or is losing control of its electron, so it's going to lose that negative charge, but at the same time it does have a positively charged proton. So now that side is going to be relatively positively charged compared to the other side of the oxygen, right? So oxygen has a much higher affinity for electrons than hydrogen. So there are polar covalent bonds and there are non-polar covalent bonds. So which is which and why? Well, I've already told you. Water has a very big difference in electronegativity between the oxygen atoms and the hydrogen atoms, so you're going to get a polar covalent bond. Whereas methane, CH4, well, the carbon and the hydrogen don't really have a big difference in electronegativity. Yeah, carbon's a little bit more electronegative, but the pull is not going to be very, very drastic, right? So they're going to share it a lot more equally. So they'll form what's called a nonpolar bond. So nonpolar covalent bond for the methane, because they have similar electronegativities, whereas the bigger difference in electronegativities between hydrogen and oxygen are going to produce the polar covalent bond. Now, fun fact, because of the specific arrangement of how this polar covalent bond is going to form, you end up with the positive on one side, the negative on the other side. You get this sort of Mickey Mouse effect. That's kind of what I think of, like an upside-down Mickey Mouse hat like people wear when they go to Disney around here. And we call that a bent shape. Go figure. Right? Bent, obviously. Okay. So let's talk about what this means, big picture. Well, this makes water an especially important molecule for biology and biological systems. It's the reason why we're looking for things. Now, throughout your life, you're going to encounter all sorts of challenges. You're going to overcome those challenges. You're going to have dreams. You're going to have realities. You're going to meet somebody and fall in love. You're going to get nervous. You're going to be afraid sometimes. You're going to drive a car. Maybe you'll engage in sports or whatever it is, right? All of those things, all of those thoughts, all of those feelings that you will ever have in your whole life and you've ever had ever since, the only reason you can have those things is because of these polar hydrogen bonds. Sorry, I gotta keep it real with you. Right? Like I said before, you're a big bag of aqueous solution with chemical reactions happening inside, and you just got to get over it. So what the hell am I talking about? Well, you know that water molecules are polar. They have polar covalent bonds. They have one side that's positive, one side that's negative. Well, if you throw a bunch of these in a spot, what are you going to end up with? Well, they're going to start to essentially arrange in a very predictable way. The negative side, the oxygen side, is going to start to orient itself towards the hydrogen sides. And you're going to see the hydrogen sides in turn oriented with the oxygen side. So you end up with a very regular pattern. Having this difference in charge from one side of the molecule to the other side of the molecule, what's known in chemistry as being amphipathic, that sort of difference allows water to interact with a whole array of things that other liquids cannot. Right? And a lot of what we're going to talk about in this first unit especially, which is the unit is water, we're going to be talking about how water does this and what the implications are for biology. It's quite a wonderful story, actually. But remember, next time you think you're high and mighty, you're slick or whatever, remember, you ain't nothing but a bunch of hydrogen bonds. Sorry, gotta tell the truth. Keep it real with you. So, what are some examples? Well, here's an example. Oil and water don't mix. Why does oil and water not mix? Here's somebody dumping some olive oil into a glass, and right away you see that the olive oil is forming a little bubble and rising to the surface and forming a layer that's distinct from the water. Right? They're not going to mix. It doesn't dissolve. Why? Well, there's a very good reason for this. Oil is a hydrocarbon. Right? It's a type of hydrocarbon. It's a carbon and hydrogen covalent bond. Just like we saw with methane. What do we know about the methane example from earlier? Well, carbon and hydrogen, very similar electronegativities, so the covalent bond that they produce is going to be nonpolar, as opposed to water, which is polar. So water can't really interact with nonpolar stuff. It can't dissolve it, right? Because there's no way to really dissolve it, meaning that the charge has to surround it, but there's no charge to surround. So the positive side of the oxygen can't surround it very effectively. So what ends up happening is they kind of partition out each other, right? So oil and water doesn't mix because of this difference in polarity. Oils tend to be nonpolar, water tends to be polar. We'll get to more of that later. So the differences in charge between the positive and the negative of a polar molecule are called dipoles, right? So these are just fairly weak differences in charges, but they're there, and they're important. Because when you have a positive and a negative dipole interacting, you form a hydrogen bond. So here, for example, is water, again, and it's interacting with ammonia. Ammonia is something you can dissolve in water, right? You can get a solution of ammonia. So ammonia is nitrogen and two hydrogens, so nitrogen is very similar to oxygen. So it'll form a dipole as well, and the negative side of the nitrogen side will orient with the positive hydrogen side on the water molecule, and vice versa. So, a quick thing, the hydrogen bond is indicated in a diagram with these dashed lines, as opposed to the covalent bonds, which are solid lines. Right? This is something you'll probably want to remember, especially if you take Chem 1, Chem 2, all those classes, right? As well as other biology classes. So just keep in mind, this is a sort of a universal notation. And since we're on that topic, a dipole is shown as a lowercase delta, which is a Greek letter, right? So if you do the Greek letter, little squiggly thing, O with a little squiggly on top, and then a negative, positive, you're indicating the dipole, whether it's a negative or positive dipole, right? Okay, so moving on. This is a primer. So we're going to expand on a lot of these ideas in future videos. So a while back, I remember this guy was big. It's actually kind of hard to do it that way. I've tried to replicate this. It's kind of hard, but whatever Salt Bae is doing here. But obviously, he got famous off of salt. Who'd have thought? Salt is quite a unique thing as well, and salt is a great introduction to the next kind of bond that we have. So here's a sodium atom. Sodium is a metal. Here's a chlorine atom. Chlorine is not a metal. They are interacting with each other. How is this interaction happening? You get sodium, you get chlorine together. They're going to produce sodium chloride, NaCl, which is what salt is. Notice what's going on. And how is this different from what we saw before? Well, hopefully you picked up on the fact that the electron, as indicated by that little arrow, seems to have left the sodium atom completely and just joined forces with the chlorine atom, thus making it a chloride ion, right? So when this happens, this is an example of ionization. Ionization is the loss of electrons or the gain of electrons. So they're forming an ionic bond. So how does the bond form? Well, sodium is losing its electron, and by doing so, it takes on a slightly positive charge because it's lost one of its electrons. And then the chlorine atom, on the other hand, is gaining the electron, so now it's taking on a net negative charge. All right? So now you have a sodium ion and a chloride ion. Well, in order for this to happen, they had to be in close proximity to each other. So now, because of this close proximity and the fact that they've changed their charges, they're able to essentially stick together and form an actual molecule this way through an ionic bond. Right? So unlike the dipoles, which are weak charges, these on the other hand are very strong charges. All right? So there's a very strong attraction here between these two atoms. So unlike a covalent bond, which is a sharing of electrons, an ionic bond is a complete transfer of electrons from one to the other. So this gives ions formal charges. Right? They're actually charged this way. It's measurable. Just a quick thing, cations is the term we use to describe positively charged ions. Anions are what we use to describe negatively charged ions. Now, the thing about salt is, it's fine as an atomic level, but when you look at the actual molecule, if you look at what Salt Bae was throwing down there or what you use when you're cooking or whatever, what you're actually looking at is a crystal. Right, and a salt crystal. So crystals are things that get formed usually when there's some sort of charges involved. So why might that be? Well, let's take a close look. So if you take a close look at this salt photo here in this little square and you blow it up, now you're seeing the arrangement of sodium and chlorine. Well, when you see them like this, you notice right away that there's a distinct pattern here, right? So you have rows of sodium and rows of chloride, right? So why do these crystals form? Well, regular patterns. A crystal is just something that has a regular pattern at the atomic level, right? So the molecule itself is regular. It has a regular pattern, and that's what makes a crystal, right? So whether you're talking about a diamond, whether you're talking about amethyst or aquamarine or any of these crystals, that's what they're about. So in this case, sodium and chloride are interacting this way because, well, the positive and negative are going to, repel themselves, right? So positive is going to repel positive, negative is going to repel negative, and they're going to attract to each other, right? And as a result, just by being in close proximity to each other, they're going to orient themselves in a particular pattern, which is crazy. I don't know if my kids used to like this, the magnetic filings, and you would put like a magnet there, and they would all just kind of orient and become a pattern all of a sudden, or all clump up. Well, same sort of thing, right? There's a force that's driving them to form a certain way, and they're going to repel each other a certain way and attract each other a certain way. Now, this same property, this positive and negative charges, also allows them to dissolve in water, obviously. You got seawater, right? You got ocean. This is Florida. We're surrounded by ocean. So the reason for this is because you got this positive-negative charge, right? And we already said how polar water has a positive and negative side. So the positive side of the hydrogens in water can surround the negative chlorine atoms, and vice versa for the sodium. So hence, you can completely dissolve a salt in water. It's not the case for everything. All right, now I'm an animal guy. If I don't talk about animals for a while, I start getting kind of a weird tick and start getting really, really nervous. So I'm going to talk about these geckos here. This is a tokay gecko. Tokay geckos are from Asia, but they're found in Florida. They're an invasive species, especially in South Florida, and they're very common. And when you grab them, they make a noise. They make this like little noise. It's really funny. And they like houses, so you can often find them inside houses. And they're actually a pretty big gecko. They're very common in the pet trade, and that's how they ended up showing up in South Florida. Geckos are well known for a lot of things, and other than giving you really good deals on insurance for your car, they also are able to climb, and climb really well, to the point where they can climb upside down on a pane of glass, which, don't get me wrong, I can do that too. I'm just a little tired right now, so I'm not going to do it for you. But the geckos can do it too, so let's focus on the geckos today. So why can they do this? And why can any human other than myself not do it? Just kidding, I can't climb upside down on glass. I wish. Well, you'll probably know that geckos have these, specialized toes. They got these little suction pad things, little toe pads. And the big thing about these guys is they have a very big surface area. So even though they're just putting their little foot on the glass, there's actually a lot of contact between the glass and the toe pads because of this little suction arrangement. And they also have these little crevices and these little hairs and little things like this. They maximize surface area, which is one way biology deals with problems, is they'll maximize the surface area of something, right? Whether it's your lungs, whether it's your intestine, whenever it needs to increase the connection, it'll do that through little projections, little hairs, and stuff like that. But that in of itself is only part of the answer for why they can do this. Well, the other part has to do with a third type of bond, what's known as the van der Waals interactions. So the van der Waals interactions are very, 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 very weak interactions. And to put it mildly, it's basically this. You have an atom. We already talked earlier about how an atom is mostly empty space, right? So there is some distance between the negative electron and the positive nucleus. So because of this empty space, well, if two atoms are in very close proximity to each other, you're just going to get this natural weak interaction between them where the nucleus is going to kind of orient towards the electrons of the other one, and the electrons are going to kind of orient away from the electrons. So you're going to get this transformation. So here's two simple atoms. They look perfectly circular. They got their negative charges, positive charges, okay. But then when they get in really close proximity to each other, we're talking at like, nanomolar level, 5 nanomolars or less, which is very close. They get that close to each other, you start getting this little interaction. Well, like I said before, it's very, 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 very weak. But if you have enough of them, it could potentially do something. And that's what the gecko does. It has such a large surface area and such a close contact between all the little hairs and projections on its toe pads that the atoms inside the epidermis of the toe pad is in very close proximity to an atom that's on the glass. And they do this. Now, if they only had a few of these, it's not a big deal. But because they've maximized their surface area, there's enough of a force there to hold them up upside down on a pane of glass. Pretty incredible if you think about it, right? That's probably how it works with Spider-Man too. I don't know. Never met the man. But if I had to guess. Okay. So I want to just kind of highlight those last three types of bonds, right? We got covalent bonds. They could be polar, nonpolar. You have ionic bonds. You have these van der Waals interactions. Three types of bonds we're talking about, right? And then as a product of the covalent bonds, being polar in the molecules where they are polar, you can also form these hydrogen bonds, right? So those are the four types of bonds that you need to know. Three of them are kind of like a intramolecule bond, and the hydrogen bonds are between molecules or intermolecule. So all of these are determined by various things, right? The valence electrons, the bonds that get formed, the type of shapes that the molecule makes, all of these things have very big implications. And this is the basis of chemistry. So in the top picture here, you have a woman who is competing, I guess, in the Nashville Marathon, I'm guessing. And she's very, very happy because, she's either in the very, very beginning of her race or in the very, very end of her race. Probably not in the middle, probably working hard in the middle. But she's very, very happy. And at the end of a race, sometimes runners will get what they call the runner's high, right? Well, that runner's high is produced by something called endorphins, right? And there's a whole bunch of different endorphins. They're a signaling molecule, kind of like a hormone, right? They basically are hormones. On the bottom picture, you have someone else who's getting a high, right? They're getting the good old-fashioned kind of high that you get with drugs, right? In this case, an intravenous injection of probably heroin, maybe a methadone, but from the environment, it looks like it's heroin. They're also getting a high. What if I told you that the reason is because of bonds, because of valence electrons, because of shapes of molecules? Everything in your life, anything in biology that undergoes any kind of change, any kind of response, usually happens because of one of two things, and sometimes both, most of the time both. Because something changed its charge, or because something changed its shape. And often it's both of those. So what the hell am I talking about? You're like, what? You show me a runner and an addict? What's going on here? Well, endorphins are fairly large molecules, and like any hormone or any sort of signaling molecule, it basically sends that signal to a cell via a receptor. And a receptor is a part of the cell that's able to recognize and interact with that molecule in a very specific way. And receptors are very specific. They recognize certain things, primarily shape of a molecule and maybe its charge. So an endorphin doesn't do anything unless it binds to one of these endorphin receptors. So it's not the whole molecule that binds to it, it's usually only a part of it. So here's a natural endorphin molecule. You see the little area that's squared in. That there is the part that's like the recognition site or the binding site for the receptor, right? So any molecule that has that can bind to the endorphin receptor and cause the endorphin response. Well, morphine and other narcotics like heroin also have a very similar, right? In fact, it's the same part. And the rest of the molecule looks different, but it's the same part that's going to bind to that receptor. So what does that mean? Well, they have the same shape, they do the same types of bonds, so the morphine can also bind to the endorphin receptor, and as a result can also produce that really good, wonderful feeling, right? Now, of course, the more often you do this, the harder it will be to get that that high, right? Because all these changes are going to happen where they're going to become less sensitive to the morphine or the heroin, right? So then you end up having to up your dose, and that's how addiction works. And guess what? That woman running the marathon, she's feeling really, really happy. But if she had to run a marathon every single day, my guess is the novelty and the smile at the end of the marathon will start to wear off too, right? So it'll probably end up having to do even more extreme marathons to get going. So this is just one example where chemistry, the basics of chemistry are determining a biological outcome. In this case, the feeling in your brain you get when you trigger these endorphin receptors, no matter how you trigger them. So with that, I will let you in on the rest of the story in Chemistry of Life Part 2. So stay tuned. Have a good day.